So we are going to talk this week about normalizing salary information, not just in job postings, but also in the work. And this came to me over the last few weeks and months because I've been watching a discussion about why job postings don't include salary ranges. And what has driven a lot of this discussion, again, is COVID. And as we talked about last week, the Great Resignation, people jumping jobs to get better wages, pay increases. Here's something on Reddit. This person has a master's degree, at least that was the requirement for the job. He went through a 3-hour interview and then found out the job paid $35K a year. And that's a level even below bachelor's degrees. I don't know exactly where he was. And this was a year. I love the topics that we do because it gets me out looking at what are other people finding and saying. Money had a section on transparency laws across different US states, and we'll talk about that soon. But they're identifying more and more that when, especially for women, when we don't have that kind of information as potential employees, we are at a disadvantage for knowing when and how and whether we can negotiate as we're being made a job offer. Generally, the research and what we all know, and I know from being a senior executive at a couple places before I retired, is employers don't like to share. They don't want to share salary information, especially. Even in one of the companies I was in, we weren't allowed below the level of vice president to have the actual salaries for every person we managed. At least that's how it was when I came in. And I said, that's ridiculous. I need everybody's budget. And I worked with contracts for USAID where you had to have exact salaries. But that had been the policy. They don't want their information out there because they don't want competitors to say, oh, these people don't pay enough or they pay too much. And they don't want employees to compare because they don't want someone who didn't negotiate hard to be jealous of someone who's getting paid more. Or in my case, the men who were hired even after me, who didn't have doctoral degrees, or even some didn't even have advanced degrees, were getting more money than I was. But this is what's happening now. Again, what we're seeing, the revolution, if you will, in employee power, is that job seekers are looking to make a job change, and they're not wanting to make a job change for the exact amount of money they're already making. They don't want a side level switch. Candidates try to research this anyway, and we'll talk about that. And I was surprised, as I was last week, to find out at last week's millennials, Gen Z, it was made up 25% of the workforce. In 3 more years, millennials will be 75% of the workforce. This really amazed me. So if employers do start sharing, they're going to stand out from the pack, and they're going to have a chance to demonstrate their commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Finally, this is becoming normalized. It's becoming normalized across a variety of settings. This started a few years ago with laws in different states. California led the way on pay transparency. Massachusetts was one of the first states to adopt equal pay. So you couldn't pay the same category of workers differently, whether they were males or females. And I have a friend who fought and won her case that she should be getting a $20,000 increase because someone else who had the same qualifications and the same job level, because Massachusetts requires it, and it can't be by gender or any other criteria that you pay differently. So California passed its pay transparency law in 2018, and we don't have a whole lot. 8 out of 50 states and territories isn't a lot, 50 plus. But let's look, as I did, at Maryland, because I live in Maryland and worked in a Maryland-based agency. Note that these laws aren't prescriptive about what employers must do. They're prescriptive about what employers need to be able to respond to. So This law that was passed in Maryland says, on request, an employer must provide this. The applicant needs to know to request it, first of all. And how many of us know from the labor laws? I didn't even realize we had this law until I went looking this weekend for the information. They also luckily can't retaliate against someone who refuses to provide a wage history, because Massachusetts, California, and Maryland are among the states where you do not need to provide your wage history. And this is new, because when I hired at the last company I was at, our application had a line item for what is your present salary. And you're not allowed to ask for this now. If someone discloses it, that's different. So now, what can you do about this? Where have you got the ability to start finding out more information about salaries? First of all, as I've just gone over, what your state laws are and your federal laws. So let's talk about, how do you find out what you're worth? These are the top 5 sites that many people use to look for salary research. And you'll find their actual salary ranges, employees who either work there or left the company who've posted anonymously how much they're being paid. And some, I believe it's PayScale or salary.com, does a survey and gets a set of information. But it can be fairly generic across a variety of levels of workers and types of work that we all do. This is where the national labor laws is important to understand. It is not illegal for an employee to talk and compare pay with others in the same company. It's not illegal, and people will cite this. They'll say it's illegal to talk pay with my coworkers, but it's not since 1935, which surprised me, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Act. Talk some more. Here are the benefits, how to price your own work. We're really finding more and more it's a way to expose discrimination, but also other unfair pay practices. What employers have been fearful of is that people may be discontent, people may not produce as much if they feel they're getting paid less for the same level of work that someone else is doing and they're not working as hard. But here's what I want you to hear. Unless your company, when you came in, made you sign a piece of paper called a non-disclosure agreement, you are even able to talk about your specific work and compensation outside of work. I don't always encourage it, but I want you to understand that you're not prohibited when you leave a company, unless they made you sign a non-disclosure agreement. Also, I thought it was useful from the ladyesquire.net, a woman who posted this last year, about before you even get an interview, if you're thinking of changing a job, for people starting out, here's some guidance on questions to ask of other people, of people who are working in the kind of position you want to be in. So what was the starting pay when you first started out in this kind of industry? And she's got 6 or 7 questions here. And if you're already working in your area, having this discussion with peers. Now, this takes on the flavor of just exchanging information about what your peers and what your friends and colleagues might be able to help you with. This usually, from what I could tell, it goes beyond your particular employer. But I want to give you the actual work that actually happened to me about 25 years ago. A friend of mine who was an evaluation director in another company called me up and said, Sue, I'm trying to determine where my salary lies. Do you mind benchmarking your salary with me? And I said, yeah, I can give you a range. So I wrote you up a sample script if you want to talk to people and find out what they're actually or close to actually being paid. What I recommend is telling people that you're benchmarking for similar positions. Give them the range of a 10K range of where your salary falls, and then ask them to tell you in 3 different bands of about 10 to 15K where their salary falls. And the reason for this is what Stephanie posted a month ago, that really it helps normalize that the discussion about pay is important, that it's okay to share it. If you don't want to share the exact number, we all understand. The person who called me was in New York City. I was in Baltimore. So there could have been differences. She was actually underpaid by my salary, which surprised me because she was in New York City, but she didn't have a doctorate and I did. So I didn't know whether that accounted for it. The important thing is to talk about it. Ask people how much they make, help them understand that it's not a forbidden topic. When I grew up, it was don't discuss politics, religion, or money. Now it's important that we do this, especially when you see that we're continuing as women, and especially women who are in historically excluded communities, how far behind the wage gaps we are in terms of the equivalent positions that men hold. This is what the future is going to look like. Nick Martin, who posts these fabulous job lists, is now finding more and more jobs that come with salary ranges. The interesting thing for me was the very bottom one. I realized it cut off, but it was a Gates Foundation job. That did not have a salary or a salary range. The others did. And on Twitter yesterday, I saw this Twitter exchange of women who were posting about how much they were hired for. Someone just left their job. This is what I got hired at. And by the way, the company likes to lowball you. And you see some of that information on Glassdoor, Indeed. But I wanted to bring this up because I think we are finally at a breakthrough where companies, and certainly global companies, are posting their salary ranges. I'm seeing more UN jobs that are doing the same thing. So lots of references that you'll be able to look at if you're interested. And I'll stop there. Ron, do you have any remarks on this or any experience you want to share?
Yeah, actually, this is a very interesting topic because it's familiar right now because of work I've been doing with a young woman from Paris who went through some of this herself. She was looking at a replacement job and she was expecting something at a similar level from where she was. She was leaving for other reasons other than pay. And it was a challenge. This is something that shocked me. She had indicated during her interview what her salary expectations were. And that seemed to be okay. Then she had a second interview with the boss, and the boss tried to talk her down. And basically, he was suggesting her demands were way higher than they ought to be, et cetera. And so she was quite discouraged. So she said she would go away and think about it. It was substantially lower than she was currently earning. So she went out and she found the job posting. And it was actually according to that job posting, it was actually in the range that she was looking at. She wanted it in a certain range, and her number was closer to the upper end of the range that they had indicated. So she didn't know what to do, but she decided to send an email to the person who first interviewed her and said, oh, by the way, I came across this. I'm still thinking, I think you need to reconsider my salary expectations. She got the job. That's at the great range she wanted. So this is in Europe, this is in France. And so I guess the question I have is that a lot of the data you've been talking about has been quite US focused. I'm curious for myself in the other jurisdictions that we're working with here, because we've got people from all over, what's it like in the local environment? And there may not be the protections that are starting to develop. It may be that people are being told, don't talk about yourself. Because I got the impression from this young lady that she was discouraged to talk about it and so on. And so there's all of this here that's trying to create an advantage for the employer, because the employer is pricing out your work for something. Yeah. And they would rather lowball than highball. And they're thinking, okay, well, I'm pricing them out at X dollars per hour, and I'm only paying them this many dollars per hour. Usually it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So you price out people at 2 to 2.5 times what you're paying them. That's how you price out their work when you're doing estimates. And so if you've got somebody who's working a little lower, well, I'm getting a little extra profit on that. The way it is, it's not good. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. There's still this business of 20 to 30% disadvantage for women. Yeah. And there is no reason for it. It's just there. Yeah.
Thank you for those remarks. In fact, the jobs that did have salary ranges, whether they were reasonable or not, that I showed you on the last screen, were international jobs, and that was great to see. So does anybody else have any experience or questions on this?
I'll jump in and just say, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Alla, and then Peter.
Hi, I just wanted to say, when I was working, they actually made a sign that we should not be talking about salary, and it seems that that's a policy that they have, that you should not be disclosing how much you're getting. And I didn't know that it was actually legal to do that until you actually said it. I was just like, why would they make us literally sign a document just to say you will not be discussing your salary and your income with anyone else? And that's how I knew that I was being underpaid, by getting in touch though with people who used to work in the same position and left, or just getting an idea of the averages. Yeah, in Saudi Arabia, I just interviewed in a few different places, and they requested that I give them a copy of my pay slip because they have competitive salaries. And I'm just like, why would I just tell me how much you're willing? And I asked HR very clearly in my interview, what's the range? Give me a range. And just like, no, it depends, and da 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 da. And they asked me to give them my pay slips, and I was just like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you my pay slips.
Good for Peter.
Yeah, I was going to say that I've seen some positions recently that do tell you upfront, and I like that. It helps me gauge whether I'm applying to the right level in that organization, because some companies use different terms for a similar position, and so it helps to know. But one of the things you said is that I think when you had the Maryland slide up, that the company can't retaliate for not sharing the past salary, but like they just don't hire you, or that's always my concern. When that pops up on the form, it's almost always a required field in the application. My concern is, well, if I don't write something, then they're just gonna not even consider me. So I don't know, I always struggle with doing that question and how to answer that.
And it's a good point. I remember you raised this when we talked about salary. We had the thing on negotiating salary a few months ago, a variation of this topic. And some of the ATS applications just allow for one number. You can't even put in a range, which is the usual recommended. And I believe you brought that up. It's very difficult to tell companies that they're not complying with laws, that they're doing things that they're not supposed to. Especially in the old days of applications when I was still hiring, people were writing them by hand or maybe putting them on the computer the last couple of years. It was just a paper application form. In this case now, it's a database everybody's entering data into. So it is hard for you because you do have to give a number, and there's still no good answer about that when they do that. But I can tell you, if that's the reason they discount you because your one number is wrong, then they're not looking at the indications of quality and employee ability to contribute. All they're looking at is a bottom line number. I don't know if that helps. Ron's nodding, so I know he has something to say.
It's not so much that I've got something to say. It's just that I worked in an organization that we had to price out work, and we would bid on contracts and so on. And so you're always into a cost control scenario. Now, the folks that I've been working with for mentoring, they've tended not to go into that same kind of an environment. But because of what I have done, their employers have every reason to be concerned about. But then the other side of it, and I think, and you pointed it out, Sue, is that the quality of the worker matters too. And so you want really high quality, but I want to get in on the cheap.
Yeah.
And there's something about employers who don't get it. And this is why with my friend that I'm working with in Paris, it was so frustrating, because here we have a quality worker, somebody who just almost kill herself to do a good job. And these people are trying to lowball her. And it's because they don't really know her, although they did see her CV and they loved what they saw. And she obviously qualified well because they wanted to hire her. And then they're trying to mess around with the pay. And then not only that, but they were cheating. So that gives you an indicator. It didn't give her a good feeling about the organization, but she's there and she's happy. But that initial thing, and it was the boss doing it, not the person who was actually the hiring manager. It was the boss that was doing it. And it's because that person worries about the budget. And yet there is that pressure, and I guess we got to be aware of it. But this idea that you shouldn't be able to talk about it and so on, you got to be able to talk about these things, because you're going to go to conferences, you're going to go to meetings, and you're going to hear about saying, why am I getting paid so low? Well, you don't live in New York City, you live in wherever, and you live down my way in Halifax. Salary scales are going to be quite a bit lower than, say, in Toronto, Montreal. So there are some other factors in there, but they shouldn't be, we're cheap.
Thank you. Any other comments? Questions? Not an easy discussion, but the good news, just like last week, is we workers are being recognized more for not the power to demand things, but more of a fairness of hearing about what we need versus what the company can pay. Can meaning is willing to or should, but maybe doesn't. So we're seeing some scales that were tipped towards the employer favorably coming down to the employees also having an ability to say and having knowledge ahead of time, like the places you can research and find out information. All right, let me open up the chat box. Does anybody have any other questions or topics? All right, and I just realized I wrote down next week's topic, and then I forgot to, oh yes. So next week, we're going to talk about, is it okay to quit your job if it hasn't even been a year? And this happened to someone I worked with last year as she secured a job, and it came up again from someone else's example earlier this week. So I thought it would be useful to talk about it. We're on a roll talking about new trends in how employees are doing work, and I think this is a good segue. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick one is that I don't know what we have of people living in different parts of the world here, but certainly the trend now for employee having the advantage, it seems, and I think I said this last week, but it's definitely becoming a real problem for employers, especially in the healthcare world. And I don't know what the experience is like elsewhere, but the advantage is to the employee at this point in time. And salaries are really going up in spite of inflation being crazy. It's already being recorded by Statistics Canada. They're starting to see the average salaries are on their way up. And that really is a reflection of this crazy environment we're in now coming out of COVID, where it seems like people have disappeared from the workforce. And I think it's people at the sort of closer to the end of their careers deciding, hey, that was okay. I think I'll stay off the workforce. And that's giving an advantage to those people who are entering or earlier in their careers to fill up those jobs. Just a thought.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. Great conclusion. I want to wish